Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Office Hours. As always, sing out in the chat line if you can't see me. Sing out in the chat line if you can't hear me. Hopefully, both those things are working. A participant has enabled closed captioning. Oh, there we go. Whoever did that, fine. Welcome, everyone. It's great to be back. Missed Office Hours last month because I was at Cloud World, which I'll talk about as we get on. But it's been a good couple of months for me. Picked myself up a brand new laptop. It's obviously not in use tonight, but in the process of slowly commissioning that. Why did I get a new laptop? Because it's got a GPU in it, so I can actually record videos now on the go. Anyone that's a regular to my YouTube channel is going, oh my God, he's going to record more videos. But it's something I like doing. So yes, new laptop to satisfy my needs for GPUs. Let me share my screen and we'll get stuck into it. A lot to get through today. Getting in touch is easy, and we'll dwell a little bit longer on that in a few slides' time. But effectively, there's my Twitter link, Connor McDonald, or if you want the plethora of links that tends to happen nowadays, go to linktree/Connor or just scan the QR code. That'll get you my blog, my Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, GitHub repo, YouTube channel, and embarrassing me to say TikTok. And of course, nowadays, it'll get you my Mastodon social, Counter social. Who knows what's going to happen as the world goes on. For those that are new to Office Hours, my Office Hours sessions, you'll see all the slide content generally not in the middle. It's sort of shifted down or to the left. No need to adjust. That's not a bug. We turn these sessions into videos after the fact, and we put my ugly mug in the top right-hand corner, and therefore we put the content down at the bottom. I don't know about you, but there's nothing more irritating than when you get some slide content and that key piece of code you are after is hidden by the speaker's face. And so I do my best to avoid that. A few bits and pieces, as I always do, to get the Office Hours session going. This is what I said I was going to dwell on before. Let's face it, things are a little bit weird in the social media space at the moment. There's a lot going on. In fact, all you have to do is follow Elon Musk on Twitter, and whatever your thoughts on Elon Musk are, there's some weird stuff going on. He's basically, talking to people who are the people who are fakes when they got fired from FTC. A lot of public arguments with his own engineers, basically falsehoods painted out. There's a lot of people thinking that basically Twitter has become a bit of a dumpster fire. Now, because of that, the only reason I wanted to dwell on that today is, as I said before, my Linktree/Connor gets you to this. What I'm endeavoring to do, because I suppose we're not entirely sure what the future of Twitter is going to be. Hopefully it will survive. I'm actually a big fan of Twitter, even though we often get stuck doom scrolling. What I'm endeavoring to do for the last month or so, ever since this sort of carnage started, is pretty much anything I post on Twitter, with the exception of just random comments in terms of tech content. I'm also trying to post on LinkedIn as well. So feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. If just in case Twitter goes under or has some drastic change that we're unaware of, hopefully you'll be able to get continued tech content from me on LinkedIn. Obviously, I'll still be doing videos on YouTube, and who knows, maybe we'll all be on Mastodon social in due course. But while we're in this state of flux, I'll do my best to keep all my tech content on LinkedIn up to date as well as Twitter. A couple of bits and pieces about conferences that have been and upcoming, etc. I went to Cloud World. That's why there was no Office Hours last month. And it's a funny thing. It was really good to be back at a nice big conference after COVID. And I'll be honest, before it started, I was thinking, oh, this sounds risky. It's brand new venue. It's not in San Francisco. It's in Las Vegas. I'd never been to Las Vegas, which was a bit of an eye opener for me. But it's for most people from internationally, it involves maybe an extra flight, a little bit more logistics, etc. But I have to admit, it was fantastic. This may not come out on Zoom so well, but this is a little sort of time lapse of people coming into my, I think, futuristic SQL session, or maybe my SQL tuning session, I can't remember. But as you can see, the rooms were just the right size. Each room held about 100. Most of the sessions had a few people, sort of unfortunates, left hanging outside the door, but it's always nice as a speaker to have a full room as opposed to an empty room. And the reality is, I was talking to Dom Giles, a Oracle person, yesterday on a podcast episode I was recording, and he made a good point. He said the reality was it was just getting insane for people to come to San Francisco as attendees. Some of the hotels were like $700, $800 a night. So I think the move to Las Vegas, while a new one this year, I think is a good one. And certainly I had a real euphoria about just being back with people, and it was one of the first times that I'd been at a conference where you'd be walking down the halls and literally, someone would throw something at you and say, "Hey, Connor," they hadn't seen him for 2 years. So I really enjoyed it, and hopefully, I think we're at Las Vegas now for the foreseeable future. So if you haven't ever been to a open world / cloud world, now's the time. Come along to Vegas next year and say hello. This is sort of a coming up, but also gone past. I did some talks for the Ausword Connect, our local user group event in the last few weeks. The reason I put it up here is you can still go to the website and register, even though the event is finished. And by doing so, you have access to the recorded webinars for the next 90 days. So there's a lot of stuff there. There was an Apex Day, Cloud Day, etc. So a lot of speakers made some good talks there. Hopefully mine went over well. But yeah, if you missed it, you can actually, in your own time, because I know Australia's maybe not in the time zone for the rest of the world, what you can do is you can go along and actually register, so to speak, for these webinars and pick up the recorded versions, but I think they only last for the next 3 months. Big things coming up in 2023. Let's face it, hopefully 2023 is the way back to face-to-face conferences as the norm, as opposed to novelty. If you're keen on Kscope, submit an abstract through the Kscope submission papers. That call for papers ends pretty soon. Similarly, Apex Connect is coming up. I think Apex World just got announced as well before I did these slides, or just after I did these slides. So I think there's also an Apex World coming up in the Netherlands. Both those got call for papers open. UKOG call for papers is done, but the event is only a few weeks away. So if you're living in Europe, as I said, support your local user groups, get along to the UKOG event. I think it's back in Birmingham this year. So I think it's back in Birmingham, which was an old sort of stomping ground of mine when I used to live in the UK and talk at the event. So that'll be a great 2-day event. Ultimately, all these things are saying one thing: support your local user groups. I work for Oracle, but most of my Oracle career originated from being members of local user groups. I was in the Australian user group for a long time, and before I joined Oracle. But even then, when I moved to the UK many years ago, I was a member of the UK user group. It really helped my career, and also just made some fantastic friendships and community. So wherever your local meetups are, please support your local user groups. I think we all win and we all prosper when we do so. I'm going to check the chat line already. Nice Mastodon for the win from Tim. Yep, and UKOG definitely worth supporting. Thank you for those endorsements. Shameless plug, I've just done a recent podcast on my Spoken Nerd podcast. The last one I've done was an interesting discussion about the high watermark on Oracle tables. So back to basics, looking at some of the internals. The next one coming out, I literally spent a couple of hours with Dom Giles yesterday on a podcast episode. So I'll edit that and probably chunk it into 3 or 4 episodes so they're nice bite-sized pieces, and we'll get into that. Now then, how are we going? Oh, I'm normally at 10 past the hour before I get here, so hopefully I'm keeping ahead of schedule. Hopefully these first 4 topics will be relatively short-lived, because let's face it, I know the only reason people are here for the 23C stuff. Yeah, this is regular Q&A that we do. This is questions that come from the community. Our job is to answer these questions. That's why I put the 23 stuff last, because I've got to engage you. So the things we're talking about tonight: SE2 hardware plan, Standard Edition 2. How should you plan your hardware? A question about VDOL flashback database log file, data pump and virtual columns, SQL loader and global temporary tables, and then we'll get on to 23C. So without further ado, Standard Edition hardware. Here's the question that came in. We're migrating a Standard Edition database, 19C. We're migrating, I think, to, I probably spelt that wrong, or typo there. We're migrating to Standard Edition 19C and planning what hardware we should get in order to give the best processing efficiency per dollar. What would be our best choice for CPU? And I suppose the best way I can answer that is it's complicated. And a lot of it depends on what your needs are, but I'll give you a few scenarios and what I would advise and what I've advised in the past customers to do if they're planning on running Standard Edition 2, and how to get the best bang for your buck, as we say. When we look at the Standard Edition 2 limits, and I've picked a little PC here as being representative of a server, you can have up to 2 sockets. So you can't go buy a 4-socket machine or a 10-socket machine. You can't go buy a monster machine. You're limited to 2 sockets on whatever piece of gear you get. Those 2 sockets can have as many cores as you want. So you can absolutely stack that machine with the most powerful, massively cored machines, sockets you can choose. That's all well and good. But Standard Edition 2 is limited to 16 concurrent threads. So effectively, it's not necessarily just 16 threads at the same time. It's 16 threads worth of work. So you could easily have 100 sessions connected, but at any given point in time, you'll be doing 16 threads worth of concurrent work. And that's what SE2 is limited at. So what does that mean in terms of buying hardware? Well, there's lots of scenarios. Your first thought is, unlimited cores, woohoo, let's go buy all the cores. Let's go get, if we're limited to 2 sockets, why not go get the 2 biggest multi-core sockets we can buy? We head over to the Intel or the AMD price list and just pick the number at the top. So let's look at things that you may or may not choose to do. If you are running a dedicated server, running Standard Edition 2, and you're just running one database on it. Let's say you're going to run your production database on that machine, and that's the only thing you're going to run. If you go out and buy a 2-socket machine with, say, 24 cores, which is sort of, pretty much the number of cores you can get now, you can get, I think, even a bit higher now, but that's pretty close to the maximum number of cores you can get per chip. I wouldn't recommend that because it's going to cost you more. Those cores are going to cost you more, but you're never going to be able to use them. Because if you're just running that one database on there, it's going to be limited to 16 threads, period. A whole lot of those cores are simply going to go unutilized. You've effectively wasted the money. Now, cores, CPUs aren't ridiculously expensive, but the reality is you may as well try to get the best bang for your buck. Conversely, and this is why I said we're going to talk about some scenarios. If you're planning on running multiple databases on that machine, so you may have one installation of Standard Edition, but you may have 2 or 3 production databases. Well, in that case, maybe it is worthwhile getting those extra cores. You're still limited to 16 threads, but what you're going to have is the overhead on the machine. You're not going to be running the machine anywhere near close to capacity. It's going to have plenty of spare cores. It's not like it's going to pick 16 of the cores and not use 8. It'll do 16 cores worth of 16 threads worth of work spread across all those cores. So if you are going to have a lot of different kinds of workload, whether it's multiple databases or multiple other kinds of workload, then yeah, you may as well, if you're limited to 2 sockets, you may as well crank those sockets up as powerful as you can. But as I said, this is a decision-making process for you as a customer. If you value things like power, price, and the ability to expand your machine over things like high availability. And let's face it, if you're running Standard Edition 2, you're not using things like automatic data guard, you're not using things like rack, etc. So maybe high availability isn't high on your agenda, no pun intended. So if it is for you, it's all about power, price, and expansion. You could, for example, just go for a 1-socket machine, which has 24 cores. You still get your 16 threads worth of performance there, but you now have the ability to put a second socket in that machine over time if the need arises. Conversely, if you value high availability over price, power, expansion ability, then having one CPU in a box is a fundamental single point of failure. Something goes wrong with that CPU and you are dead in the water until you can move the entire operation somewhere else or go buy a new CPU. That's obviously possibly a lot of downtime. So if you value the availability of your system over things like power, price, the ability to expand it, you may as well buy a machine that has the 2 sockets in it already. And then you might choose to have a lower number of cores. Now, why would I choose a lower number of cores? Because generally the top end speed for a CPU is better for a lower number of cores. Generally machines work the compromise between multi-core performance and single core performance. So generally if you get less cores, you might be able to run those machines a little bit faster. The other thing here is to understand the usage model for the Oracle database. People think, oh, I'll go get a GPU or I'll go get a machine with all sorts of trendy CPU components. The reality is, I remember there used to be a company called Simulus. Julian Dyke, famous guy in the UK Oracle scene, used to work, I think, many years ago for a company called Simulus, where they dug into what the Oracle database did at its lowest level. And it turned out that something like 80% of everything an Oracle database does is either memory access or integer arithmetic, because we don't use a lot of the floating point stuff in the Oracle database. We do some of the on CPU instructions for in memory, but for Standard Edition 2, you're pretty much looking at integer arithmetic and memory access. So what you want is CPU and memory that does that best. That normally means high megahertz or high gigahertz on your CPU. and very, very fast RAM. So 16 threads means faster cores is probably better than more cores. If you have a 16 core machine, it might top out at say 5 gigahertz. If you have a 32 core machine, it may top out at say 4 gigahertz. You get a lot more cores, but if you can only run 16 threads anyway, you may as well get the fastest cores you can. Similarly, the definition of fast is not necessarily just the gigahertz speed. Look at things like the L1, L2, level 3 cache, because as we said, Oracle is all about memory access and picking up stuff on cache lines. Things like mutexes and latches will sit nicely on those fast caches. And obviously, fast, the definition of fast here is fast memory. Get the fastest memory you can for that machine, or get the motherboard that supports the fastest memory, DDR5, etc. If you do that, you'll be able to get a stonking amount of workload even through standard edition. And obviously fast means you'll notice in the standard edition version, we don't say, oh, you can have 16 threads and 512 gigs of RAM. Have as much RAM as you want. So pick a system that supports very, very high amounts of RAM, but be aware you'll always be trading off. Generally, the bigger amount of RAM you have, sometimes you don't get the maximum speed of that memory, but you can work that balance. Now, I will say one thing. If you aren't running Standard Edition 2, I would encourage you to look at this document. There's the link, oracle.com, assets, PAS, IS, universal credits. It's a description of all the licensing facilities when it comes to running servers on cloud. It's a big document, but if you hunt down to page 115, last time I looked, so yeah, it's tucked away on page 115. There's this little paragraph about if you're running Standard Edition or Standard Edition 2, then there's this. For each supported processor license, so if you've got a 2-socket box on Standard Edition 2, you can migrate that machine to a cloud autonomous database and get 4 OCPUs for each socket. What that means is, for the same price you're currently paying for Standard Edition 2 on premises, you could move that workload to autonomous, and effectively the cost you will pay is the same, and for that you get 8 OCPUs on autonomous. Now, that blows my mind. This bothers me as an Oracle employee because I don't like the fact that we're giving you such a good deal, because ultimately that might hurt my salary. But the reality is, for the same price, you're moving from Standard Edition features to Enterprise Edition, because Autonomous pretty much is all the Enterprise Edition features. And if you go to apexoracle.com/database features, if you do the line between Standard Edition 2 and Enterprise Edition, see like the solitary tick there for Standard Edition? If I keep scrolling through, look at that first column. So much stuff is not on Standard Edition 2 that is on Enterprise Edition/Autonomous, like literally so many features. Plus, if you're on Autonomous, we're going to back it up for you. We're going to patch it for you. We're going to monitor it for you. We're going to upgrade it for you. All that stuff that you had to do yourself on Standard Edition 2 goes out the window. Classic example. In May in 2020, when I first got myself an Autonomous database, I logged onto it. It's a ATP low, you can see there. It was 19.3. I've done very little with that database. I pretty much log onto it every once in a while through demos and stuff. I've done nothing in terms of the management of us, but literally last month logged on, it's on 19.17. Someone, not me, thankfully, has applied 14 release updates to that database. So yeah, so I think it's a no-brainer if you're on Standard Edition 2 and you're a company that can relocate services to cloud to get 8 OCPUs for the same price and pick up all the Enterprise Edition features, plus REST, plus ORDS, plus Apex, etc., and have the whole thing managed for you, blows my mind. As I said, SE2 to Autonomous, if you can do it, if your company supports moving to cloud, for me is just an absolute no-brainer. Number 1 done. Conscious of the time. VDollar flashback database log file. Just a single VDollar view sitting inside the database. The question came in my VDollar flashback database log file view, some of the entries have a type of normal, others have a type of reserved, but the documentation is not particularly helpful. Can you please explain? So I went and looked at the documentation and it looks like this. It says the type has normal, reserve, free, and to delete. And I didn't put it in here, but underneath it says normal, these are for normal entries. Reserved are for reserved entries, etc. So I understand, probably I'll log a bug in the docs, maybe a little bit more explanation here. So I've done a few diagrams here to help explain hopefully what those 4 entries mean. What we've got in the box is effectively your allocation, your space allocation for flashback logs, and time is moving across to the right. So over time, as flashback logs are required, they'll simply be built, etc. Now, eventually, right? Oh, yep. So flashback logs will be built over time, and we slowly fill up the area. Now, rather than extending all through time, let's now look at time as it moves throughout the duration of your database. So you do some changes, you generate flashback log 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5. Now, in terms of efficiency, what the database will do, it doesn't necessarily just allocate a flashback log as the next one is required. It can pre-allocate them. So you might be writing, say, flashback log number 3 or number 4, and it will actively go and build empty flashback logs 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10 out into the future, ready for use. And the reason we do that is, you know, that the creation of a file normally is more expensive than actually just writing to a file. It's the same with reader logs. That's why we have our reader logs. They go around in a cycle. We don't build new reader logs because it's expensive. That's why we have a separate process to write archive logs, because it's writing new archive logs. The flashback archiver that writes these logs does the same thing. It says, why not pre-allocate some log files? Because in that way, when they come to be needed, we just go start writing an existing file. We don't have to pad it out with information, which takes time and hurts performance. The ones that get pre-allocated, that's what a free flashback archive log file is. It's one that hasn't been used, it's free, it's been pre-allocated by the database. Now, for certain customers in high volume environments, we actually encourage them even to use these hidden parameters, which actually lets you choose how much space you want to pre-allocate. Obviously, you wouldn't use it. You'd have to get Oracle support's guidance for particular use cases, but normally you wouldn't ever have to do that. But the database itself will pre-allocate some of these files, and they're called free. If we move along now to the other scenarios, what I've got here is the orange line there in the vertical to the left is what my flashback retention target is. So the blocks is how much space I have for flashback logs, and my flashback retention target is far enough back so I want to keep all of them. So over time, we'll start building out logs 1 through 10, and eventually we'll build number 11, and we want to keep all those because our flashback retention target is way back in time, even more so than flashback log number 1. But we're out of space. We can't do it. We can't actually meet that target. What do? We have to delete the oldest one. You know, conceptually, we shift them all down. Obviously, they don't actually move. And then we can build the next flashback log, flashback number 12. This is what we call normal flashback logs. All these ones will be tagged with the status of normal in VDOLA flashback log file because they're just in normal use. But consider this scenario where my flashback retention target is actually not massively back in the past. I don't have any restore points, so I don't hang on to my logs for so long. I might just say I want to hold them for 15 minutes, but my log file area could easily hold more. What's going to happen there? So here I got some flashback logs being built, F1, F2, F6. In this case, F2 to F6 were perhaps free. They were pre-allocated, but now they're all used up. Now when I want to write F7, well, F1 is dropped past it's dropped out of my retention target. I no longer need flashback log number 1. Rather than write a brand new flashback log, which as I said, can be costly to build a new file, we will simply repurpose flashback log number 1 and it becomes flashback log number 7. Now, the key thing to stress here is, I think I put it in, these are what we call reserved. So flashback log number 1 is no longer required. The database sees that flashback 6 will eventually fill shortly, so we repurpose flashback log number 1 and make it flashback log number 7. It's reserved and ready for use for the next flashback log to roll into. Now, I want to stress here, it doesn't change the name. You know, it'll still look like in your VDOLA flashback log file, it'll have the same name as it has when it was called flashback log number 1. That's why it's important not just to assume the name in any way represents some sort of chronology. It doesn't. The flashback log is repurposed, but it keeps the same name. So it'll still be called flashback number 1, but it's now serving the job of a recent flashback. That's what we call a reserved flashback log until it becomes in use, and then it would become normal. If in this same scenario, there were even older flashback logs floating around in your system, And they don't need to be repurposed because you've got plenty of, you grad number one and it's being repurposed anyway. These ones be called to delete. They're not ever going to be used. They've dropped well past the retention target. The database has decided they're not needed to be repurposed because I've got plenty of like F1 can be repurposed continuously. They'll be marked as to be deleted. And there we have the 4 kinds of entries for flashback log file. Overriding all of this is because you can see we are occasionally deleting log files. Sometimes we are repurposing them, the same name, but for a different effectively set of changes. You don't want to be messing around with these things with the OS layer, because if you go delete one just because it looks like it was the oldest log file, it may well have been the most current log file. So please don't play with them at the OS layer. Number 2 done. It's funny how there's very little chat tonight, which I know is everyone's way of saying, don't interrupt him, let him get through the stuff and we get on to 23C, but we'll do our best. Data pump and virtual columns. Here's the question that came in. When we use data pump to copy one schema to another, we get warnings in the log file about virtual columns. But the virtual columns are actually successfully created, so is it possible to suppress these warnings? And sadly, it's a lot worse than you think. The reason those warnings come out, even though the virtual columns are created, are very important, and we'll explain that with our first demo of the night. So I'm going to create a couple of users, demo 1 and demo 2. Demo 1 will hold all the data. We'll give some appropriate grants so they can do all their stuff. Give some quotas, do some writes on temporary so we can do data pump from each one to the other, and we're good to go. So we'll create a table in demo 1 and create a few things in demo 1 actually as copies of Scott. So demo 1's got a table called emp. It's got a function called get modified sal. It's just something that's going to take the salary and add 100 to it. And we'll add a virtual column to this emp table. So I've got a copy of scott.emp, a function, and here's my new virtual column. The new salary is generated, and it's going to be a call to this function, get the modified salary, which as you can see just adds 1 to the salary. So if I query it, here's my wonderful application, demo1.emp, 3 columns that are normal columns plus a virtual column, which simply adds 1 to the salary. I'm super happy with this application in demo 1. I'm thrilled. Now I'm going to data pump it out so I can put it into schema demo 2. Now, as we know, data pump can take a little bit of a while to get going, especially when you're doing a Zoom recording, which is being recorded, but let's see how we go. So we've started on demo 1. We're basically dumping out the entire schema. Off we go, tables, indexes, etc. Chug, 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 chug. Poor little machine. I should have used the new laptop, shouldn't I? Come on. Come on. Come on. And we're done. So there we go. We've unloaded the entire demo 1 schema. I'm happy with that. Now I want to load it into the demo 2 schema. So it's just import on a data pump. Off we go. And off it goes. And we can see, it got our table in there, but these are the warnings our customer was speaking about. I got invalid identifier, alter table demo, modified. I got a whole lot of warnings. Let's go have a look inside demo 2 and see what the state of play is. If I go look at the list of objects inside demo 2, I got my table called emp. That's fine. I got my function, get modified sal. So the 2 objects that were in demo 1 successfully made it into demo 2. And we got these warnings about virtual columns. So maybe I just were missing that. I'll just go add that virtual column back in. Maybe that's the workaround here. But this is the weird thing. It says, yep, you tried to add a column that already exists. So even though I got a warning saying I couldn't add the virtual column, it appears that column is actually there. So let's have a look at demo2.emp. And as we see, yes, there is that column new sal. So the virtual column is there. Let's do dbms metadata and get the full metadata, the full DDL for this table. So what have we got? We got emp no, etc. And here's my, it's a new virtual column generated virtual, but where's the function? Nothing. We created the virtual column, but we dropped the definition that we wanted to bring across with us. It's gone. which is not so good because it looks like it's correct, but it's actually missing some vital components. The only way to get around this is to drop that column because it's obviously incorrect. Then we can add the virtual column now with the correct syntax we wanted, which is this get modified cell, and we're good to go. Now, I didn't dwell long on the warnings there. The reason it did this is when you create a virtual column in Demo1 schema that calls a function, the virtual column definition actually says call function demo1 dot function name. Therefore, when you bring that over to Demo2, it is actually trying to say, I want to add a virtual column that calls demo1 dot function name. It didn't have the privileges and therefore it refused to do it. It's just unfortunate we actually still got the virtual column added. It's just obviously an incorrect definition. As I said, it's a bit worse than you think because we sort of end up with this half-baked virtual column that isn't really what we wanted, but you may just have some validation functions that say, is the column there? Yes, then we're good to go. Obviously, you really weren't. This is a known bug. We're working on a fix, but you just need to be very aware. I'm a big fan of virtual columns, especially do virtual columns and make them invisible for adding new functionality without impacting applications. And the problem there is you could end up with this sort of corruption going on. As I said, be careful. One workaround that we've suggested for this customer is if you put those particular functions that are going to be used inside virtual columns into a common schema and let any schemas that are going to have applications reference them, let them call them, then of course, when you say, in Demo1, you'll say virtual column references common schema.function. And therefore, when it comes over to Demo2, it will also and correctly reference common schema.virtual function and everything will be fine. But that's obviously a relatively large undertaking if you've got a lot of these things floating around. But one would imagine there shouldn't be too many PL/SQL functions that are being used as virtual columns due to the context switch overhead. But there is workarounds available, but just a heads up there, be aware when you're using Data Pump with virtual columns, you can get yourself into some grief. Okay, fourth one. Quick check of the chat line. Yes, Bernard's made a good point. You would then have to obviously data pump that common schema as well to target environments if you're going to a brand new database as opposed to just another schema in the same database. Ooh, some Q&A. Remap schema parameter, good point. To my knowledge, it does not go in and dig in actually inside the virtual column definition. So no, it does not. So excellent, thanks for pointing that out. SQL Loader and global temporary tables. I want to use SQL Loader to load some data into a temporary table, but it immediately errors out, is there any workaround? Now, when this question came up, I was quite confused because a temporary table is something that you load data into it, and when your session ceases to exist, the temporary table is gone. So if you're running SQL Loader to load data into a temporary table, the moment SQL Loader finishes loading, the data's gone. It seems a very odd requirement, and I think that's why SQL Loader just goes, this makes no sense. Why do you want to load into a temporary table? And it's an odd question. But after further investigation, there is a legitimate reason why someone may want to do this. And before I say that, I would recommend generally if you are running SQL Loader in what I call niche circumstances, whether it's into temporary tables or has particular requirements that means you have to sort of perturbate what you're doing in SQL Loader, take a look at external tables. They're sort of deemed the replacement of SQL Loader, and you just get a lot more functionality and power. But let's see what we can do in terms of SQL Loader into a temporary table. So I'm going to create a user called demo as just a DBA user. I'm just being lazy just so we can do our stuff in this user called demo. Let's create it. And let's create a global temporary table called emp, which is on commit preserve rows. So I'm doing my best to at least hang on to the rows as long as I can as select star from scott.emp. And here I've pre-created an emp.ctl file, which SQL Loader would use to simply load in the standard data that we get from scott.emp. So fields terminated by a comma, and you can see it's just comma separated with the standard format. Let's fire up SQL Loader, and as our customer reported, it immediately stops and says, you can't do that. It's a temporary table. Now, the question is why? On further explanation is we still haven't answered why someone would want to do this. Well, as you know, what you can do inside SQL Loader in the control file has plenty of power, but it's not as flexible as SQL. So you can do things like load when, and you can do a few expressions on the columns, but that's pretty much it. So in this particular case, when you're trying to answer the but why, it turned out that one of the use cases that you might want to do is you might have a table called some target table. And that's ultimately the final resting place for the data that you're trying to load. But you've got a lot of stuff you want to do to this data as it comes in that SQL Loader is not equipped for. That's why an external table maybe be a cool idea. But if that's not available, or you have a lot of SQL Loader floating around in your existing system, well, one way you could do is do something like this. If I could load into a global temporary table, I'm not actually after the data to end up in there. What I'm really using it as a staging area to apply some logic to pump it into my true target table. So in this case, all I really want to do is as the data is coming into my employee table, my global temporary table, what I really want to do is do some conditions, like if the new salary is greater than 1,000, then do a query, check the Scott department table. If it's there, then do this, and add a new column, do some some logic. Some of this I could do with a SQL Loader control file, but most of this logic I could not. And so it's this two-phase process. I'm using SQL Loader to get the flat file into a database, but then I want to use a trigger in the database to move the data to its true destination. I don't really care about the emp table, and that's why I want to do it as a global temporary table. And so I understand the motivation for doing this now, that there actually is a particular use case where I actually aren't interested in what I'm SQL Loadering into. I'm actually interested into the next step, which is my target table. So can I do it? Yes, you can, with a little bit of trickery. Take your global temporary table and rename it. In this case, I could have dropped it, I've thrown it away. Now I'm creating a view, a select star from my global temporary table. So I have a view called emp that's now select from my global temporary table. Dropping my trigger on the employee table and recreating that trigger as an instead of trigger on the view with the exact same logic. There's nothing changed there. It's interesting, you cannot SQL Loader into a global temporary table, but you can SQL Loader into a view. So now I run SQL Loader. I'm running the exact same control file. You can see it said I loaded 14 rows into my table, but in reality, those rows went into the view, fired the trigger, got obviously ignored in the view, and then certain rows, in fact 12 rows of the 14, made their final destination or final resting place of the target table. So if you do need to run SQL Loader into I'll call it a fake table because you wanted to run a trigger to do some more sophisticated logic to get it into a final table, global temporary tables are out, but a view, which almost seems counterintuitive or a contradiction, a view can be used to SQL Loader into, and you can work around the problem. Look at this, 20 minutes to go, and now we can talk about Cloud World. Oh, we got some Q&A. The same is probably true for other objects. Yes, not just virtual columns. Yep, various things that you need to be careful with when you're data pumping, even with the Renap schema. I was sort of hoping that was going to be a question that took 20 minutes to answer, and there'd be very, very upset people on the call going, where the hell is our 23C stuff? Okay, let's talk Cloud World because that's where a lot of the 23C announcements were made. As I said, people are going, enough of the Q&A. I don't care about SQL Loader. Tell me about the 23C stuff. And for those that came along, thank you very much for joining the call. G'day everyone, Connor here. By now you're probably thinking, where's the 23C stuff? In the office hours session we just ran, the session ran way over time because we had so much good stuff to talk about. And I figured probably best, rather than bore you even further, then we'd put the 23C stuff into its own separate video. It all got a bit rushed and therefore I flew through the demos and I figured it's better just to cut this video short here and we'll do a separate video with the 23C stuff where I can take a bit more time. So apologies if you've been watching this video waiting for the 23C stuff, it is coming. But until then, please join my next office hours session. Thank you very much for watching this video or watching this office hours session. And hopefully we'll see you soon on another session. Until then, bye for now.